Hello, well, you should have arrived here expecting an essay on My Last Duchess by Robert Browning and Ozymandias by Percy B. Shelley. So if you have, you're in the right place. Make sure you've got those poems in front of you so that this essay makes sense. I will put a link up here later on in the video to the video about how to construct an essay that's linked to this one. But in this video, I'm just going to read this teacher's essay, talk through the advantages and disadvantages of writing this way, and then show you why it would probably get full marks. Well, it ought to because he's got a degree in English. Right, here we go. So compare how poets present ideas about power in My Last Duchess and one other poem. So your first job is to memorize Ozymandias. Ozymandias will always be relevant because you will only get asked two kinds of questions. One will be about power and one will be about conflict. And Ozymandias will always be a relevant poem when you're writing about power. So for 50% of the questions, Ozymandias will be your go-to poem, and I would suggest that Charge of the Light Brigade will be your go-to poem for any question about conflict instead of power. Charge of the Light Brigade is very memorable. It shouldn't be too hard to remember because it's really repetitive, really easy to write about. So here we go. Both My Last Duchess and Ozymandias are based around pieces of art which the main subject of the poems have commissioned or had produced to order. So that's similarity number 2. They're both about art. The art has been produced to order. Similarity number 3. Both the main characters are men. Similarity number 4. Who have used art to display their wealth and power. So very sophisticated way to start is by listing all the similarities that you can think of, but they're connected to the same idea of power being linked to art. In My Last Duchess, the Duke has had the most famous artist of his day, Fra Pandolf, please notice the capitals used correctly, paint a picture of his wife. She therefore becomes a kind of possession. So my students, when they deal with this, are immediately prompted to write about the patriarchy or a patriarchal society. Look that up if you're not sure what it means. But it's basically saying a society ruled by men for men to the exclusion of other genders. In the poem, we later learn that the fate of his last duchess was to be killed on her husband's orders. And then he needs a quotation here, really, doesn't he? But he hasn't put it in. So because he can write 821 words, he can get away with that because he will show the skills later, but you won't be writing as much, and therefore you can't get away with that. You need the quotation about him giving commands, then all smiles stop together, or that line about the half flush dying on her throat, which is an allusion to how he's had her killed, possibly through strangulation. Right. The other thing he's done, which I really hate, is he said it's in the poem. Well, the examiner knows that because they've asked you to write about this poem and the other poem, and so they know it's a poem. Don't tell the examiner stuff that any fool should know. So my apologies to the teacher, but don't do that. In Ozymandias, Shelley passes on the story told him by a traveller from an antique land of a colossal statue found in the desert with the text, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." So there's no marks for this at the minute because it's just telling us the story of Ozymandias. Okay, but the marks come here. Ironically, this statue is now only a pair of huge feet and a decapitated head. Now, because he hasn't memorized this poem, he's found it harder to get the shattered visage. So decapitated, shattered visage here would have fit, or two trunkless legs of stone, which would have fit instead of pair of huge feet. The point here seems to be that however mighty a ruler might be in life, time and the elements will destroy their legacy, even if their name remains. So that now their name remains, refers back to this quotation, but actually he forgot the bit that goes at the beginning. My name is Ozymandias. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. So again, it's a slightly weaker response at the beginning, and that's typical of what happens in the exam. Because at the beginning you're not fully in control of the question. You get better and better as you go. But that does remind you of the most important exam technique, which is never stop writing. Because if you keep writing, your answer will get better and better and you will score more and more points. And I hope you can see how this beginning is not as strong as the rest of the answer will be, or indeed as these four similarities were. So in bold, I have examples of every occasion where the candidate here is writing about the poet's purpose. This gives him a conceptualized response and forces the examiner to jump up to level 6. So let's have a look at that in detail. Shelley was possibly thinking of the most powerful man of his time, Napoleon Bonaparte, the French emperor, as a comparison with the long-dead pharaoh Ramesses II, the original Ozymandias. So that's good. The tentative language of possibly thinking is something that the examiner will like because it shows you're being exploratory. But he hasn't said why he would compare it to Napoleon Bonaparte. So perhaps he's attacking Napoleon Bonaparte because he's a dictator and because the British were in fear that Napoleon would invade. Those would be reasons why a contemporary reader would be interested in this depiction of Ozymandias as a tyrant. Okay, let's get to the next paragraph. My Last Duchess, and note the quotations around the title, and the capitals are always there, and capital for Duke and capital for Duchess. Don't forget that when you're writing about these poems. So My Last Duchess begins with the Duke himself speaking in a dramatic monologue. So that's a phrase you're just going to have to remember because you will always use it when writing about My Last Duchess, as Browning named his poems. It seems as if we are eavesdropping on the conversation, which is halfway through. It seems conversational and informal enough until the Duke utters the phrase, if they durst, suggesting that he has power over people which they do not want to offend. So this is quite sophisticated. Rather than just saying that language there shows how powerful the Duke is, this makes a point about how the Duke exercises that power. So he wants to appear conversational at the start, and then, because he wants to seem friendly, but then he lets the Count's representative know that actually he's far from friendly, he's formidable. As the poem progresses, the reader is anxious to know. Well, as the poem progresses is a bit gibberish, really. Poems don't make progress. We can just leap to the reader is anxious to know how the Duchess, whose painting is as if she were alive, actually died. It increasingly seems that the Duke, along with his power, carries jealousy and this surprising insecurity. And it would be even better if he linked this to the poet's purpose here. Is he saying that all powerful people are prone to using their power in harmful ways, such as through jealousy? Right, the Duchess's innocent pleasure in everyday things, the bower of cherries and the white mule, is offensive as she values his expensive gift as only the same, my favour at her breast, my 900-year-old name. And that should really be a colon to introduce that explanation, as he did there. So let's just correct that. He regards his jealousy as reasonable for a man of his status, and it feels even to, and that should be he feels, that might well have been my typing error, not his. He feels even to discuss it with his wife would be to stoop, a phrase which implies placing yourself below someone else. So he's just letting the examiner know that he knows why the Duke has used that phrase, although I don't think you actually need that. So you could have written, in order to discuss it with his wife would be to stoop, a phrase which shows his rejection of inferiority or what have you. Anyway, this is a detailed analysis of the character, but I'm still waiting for it to be conceptualized by being linked to the poet's purpose, which will be down here. Okay, so bear that in mind. He chooses never to stoop, and thus gave commands, and all smiles stopped. That's a bit of storytelling, but he prevents that being only storytelling by showing us what that implies. This clearly implies he had the Duchess murdered, an appalling admission which he apparently thinks is entirely reasonable. The context of the Middle Ages when Browning set this poem is a time when girls and women were virtually sold by their families and could be dispensed with by their husbands if they did not please them. Even more appallingly, the clever structure of Browning's poem reveals, let's double click on that and get rid of the gap, at the end that the visitor the Duke has been addressing throughout is an emissary from a count with whom the Duke is negotiating his next marriage. So this is a very good introduction of the context here, because it's relevant to the point he's making, that the Duke's behaviour is appalling and that the reader should be appalled by it. The context he's chosen here is the Middle Ages, which is true. That's when this story is supposed to have happened in Ferrara. However, Browning is choosing it in order to make a point about the 1800s, where women are still treated largely as possessions of men. So this is still a patriarchal society, and my students would use the word patriarchy in discussing this in order to show Browning's wider purpose to attack it, and also to point out the injustice of the way women are treated. You'll notice that the Duchess doesn't even get given a name here, but the male artists do. So this point about the patriarchy is quite important. Right. Clearly the reader fears for the next Duchess, given the fate of the last one. The coldness of the dowry negotiations with his fair daughter's self is clearly appalling. So again, he's emphasizing the poet's purpose to appall us at this male abuse of power. Even more appalling is the everyday casual way the Duke then turns to his other possessions, the statue of Neptune. And again, that idea of treating women as possessions links naturally to a discussion of the patriarchal society. Whilst the Duke in My Last Duchess can continue to abuse his power by taking another bride, we see that arrogance and self-importance will not last forever. And this is a clever comparison now to the other poem. Ozymandias' wrinkled lip and brow are now remnants of his faded power, showing that however rich and powerful the man might be, there are still the ravages of time. So now when you start to introduce a difference, again, that's a way of you showing a conceptualized response. You find things which are similar and then a difference about that same thing. So they're both similar in that they're discussing power, but they're both different in the way that they see how power will last or not. And then he's given us here some wider reading. So this is a Roman proverb, sic transit gloria mundi, which he's translated for us here. The splendor of the world is short-lived. And the reason that's relevant is that readers at the time that Browning wrote, around about 1820, would have known this phrase. It would have been common, something that they all covered in their schooling. Now we get, for me, the best bit of the essay. One of the problems that I have is that students often write about the structure in a really bizarre way. They try desperately to link the structure to something. So, for example, I've seen answers that look at the sonnet and they decide that the sestet and the octet are there to mimic the shape of the statue standing on the pedestal. Well, no, not really. It's just that that's how sonnets are structured. that's just too random an idea. I've seen answers that say, Ozymandias uses a lot of enjambment, which shows that the poet is confused. Well, no, it doesn't, not at all. It just stops the poem having that dum-de-dum-de-dum sort of rhythm where you can predict what the rhyme's going to be. So it actually makes it a much more interesting poem. It's not linked to purpose in that way. Now, hopefully, as we get into this, you'll see how the structure is made relevant to the essay. So Browning, this is my Last Duchess we're talking about, uses rhyming couplets for a dramatic monologue, which is skillfully written to seem like speech. This is mainly due to his use of enjambment. So you see what I mean? That's the point I was making, not not signalling when it's going to rhyme. And sentences where the speaker seems to add signed comments as if he is improvising. Okay, well now I've got to link that to the author's purpose, or this is just telling the examiner everything I know about the structure. So I get no marks for that at all unless I can link it to a purpose. So here it comes. This allows a voice or persona to emerge gradually. Okay, so that's not bad. It's telling us that it's behaving like a piece of theatre in a way, where I'm gradually getting to know the character. The poem begins and ends as the Duke enters and departs, almost as a slice of life. Oh, okay. So it's not so much the drama that he's going for, the theatre. This candidate is saying that it's to recreate real life, to seem natural. Okay, I'll accept that. Shelley's choice of form in Ozymandias is also interesting and conveys a message. So this is much better because he immediately lets the examiner know that what he's going to say about the form of the poet, about it being a sonnet, is going to be relevant to the message that Shelley has. The sonnet is a precise, complex form which Shelley skillfully manipulates by varying the standard verse form, linking the first 8 lines to the last 6 with the rhyme of kings. This highly formal and carefully organized form maybe represents the sculpture's original completeness and intended indestructibility. Well, you can just about get away with that, can't you, really? That's quite a sophisticated idea, suggesting that because the sonnet is such a tightly knit form, all the lines are interweaved together, that's reflected in what Ozymandias and the sculptor wanted from the structure to the sculpture. He wanted it to be able to last forever. However, it is clear that power of the kind described in the poem doesn't last forever, a relief as well as a warning to despots like Ozymandias. Then we have a quite sophisticated conclusion that tries to evaluate and therefore tries to come up with a difference between the two poems, which is significant. Let's see how he does it. The reader has quite a different feeling at the end of Browning's poem. The hideous Duke is alive, well, and very much in possession not only of his power, but of those around him, including the poor women he can treat as possessions to do with as. So there should be no it there, my apologies. To do with as he pleases. Perhaps Browning wanted Victorian readers to compare the status of women and the power of men. And so that's a point that I was making much earlier in discussing the patriarchal society, and that's a point that he's made later. Okay, let's return to the Marc scheme. So that ending has allowed him to be convincing and critical. It was also exploratory because he had this final perhaps at the end. Has it had judicious use of precise references? Well, basically you're looking for quotations that are embedded in sentences. Some of my students do that better, I have to say, but yes, he got away with that. Is it exploratory? Well, look at the tremendous detail of all the paragraphs. Yes, it is. Is it well structured? Yes, it does tend to go from comparing, one poem to the next, one to the next, one to the next. Is it conceptualized? Well, you saw all that bold writing, which showed you how he was always considering the poet's purpose. Is there a fine-grained, insightful analysis of language and form and structure? Well, you can definitely see that there was about the form and structure of the poems, and there was obviously loads of analysis about language. So he's done that. Judicious use of subject terminology. I've already explained how he did that so convincingly in discussing the form and structure of the poems. And has he been convincing? Well, you only need one or more idea to be convincing, which is quite good, isn't it? And the answer, of course, is yes. So that's a full mark answer, even though it has quite a few weaknesses in it that I'm trying to change. And that's important for you to remember. This is an exam aimed at 15 and 16-year-olds, isn't it? You don't have to have a degree to answer it. So you would expect that to be an answer that's better than full marks, which it is, despite some of its weaknesses. In my next video, I will give you an answer written by one of the students in my class who's been using videos well to revise. It's not going to be a full mark answer, but it will be a level 6. And that will be a good comparison for you to see what you could write under exam conditions, 40 to 45 minutes compared to a teacher. You might find it even more relevant because it will be working with the same word limits you're working to, and also make the same sort of mistakes that you're making. Phew, well, nearly 22 minutes. Well done if you've got to the end. Follow the links, they'll be appearing around here somewhere. If you'd like to subscribe, oh, that's my face here. I must get rid of the sunglasses actually and do something a bit better. And well, good luck in your revision, but don't leave it to luck. Get practicing, keep subscribing, keep watching, and good luck.